Hey everyone, Professor Snart checking in, more of the talking head variety of check-in here. So we've just finished up Unit 4 and moving into what I talked a little bit about in the last video announcement that captured more of my screen is our, excuse me, our first group assignment. Most people are just with a partner, so it's like small groups, but still a group assignment. So one of the things that I'm really trying to stress here is that you connect with your person, your partner, as soon as possible. So we have the course of both Unit 5 and 6 to do the group project. But it's really important that you get in touch with your person and make that first sort of contact sooner rather than later. So you don't want to wait until the due date of Unit 5 to just be making that move, and then you're kind of rushing and potentially running into basic communication and technical problems while you're trying to get through Unit 6, which you should be doing the project itself. So I'm just going to actually look at our course here. In Unit 5, you'll see that it's mostly set up, and I know I talked about this in the earlier video, so I won't belabor it, but obviously the project assignment is here, so you get the basic details, but the task for you really is just to get into this little planning wiki space. You'll see a page has already been created with your group, your partner there. So all you've got to do is get in there and just sort of like, be present. And we really want to do that now rather than waiting till the due date for Unit 5. So one of the main things that you want to establish then is connecting with your partner in terms of how you're going to communicate, whether it's the student email system or if you're going to text each other, like whatever you guys are comfortable with within your group, that's what you should do. So there's no mandate from me about how you should communicate, other than you need to establish that as a group and sort of agree upon it, like right up front. And then you can start to think about the project itself, possible ideas. Again, Unit 5 can be a bit of a brainstorming phase here as well. You'll see that each wiki page has some prompts here to get us thinking about, again, primary, secondary means of communication. You can begin to brainstorm, considering a platform for your project. Maybe you'd like to work in that Google Slide environment. It's really good for collaborative work. Maybe you'd like to investigate building a website, kind of to bring your project to life a little bit. But again, that stuff, you want to have that discussion now with your group, and then move forward right as we get to the tail end of Unit 5 and of course into Unit 6. Especially being conscious that if you run into technical problems or communication problems, it's important to involve me in that or let me know about it, but again, now rather than right at the tail end of Unit 5 or worst, once we're actually into Unit 6. So like I said before, the idea of group work in an online class might be a little bit new or unfamiliar, but I think it's totally doable, and in fact I think it's really important to do so that your experience taking an online course is equivalent to, or it provides the same kind of opportunities for engagement and working with your peers, interacting with your peers, that a face-to-face class would. I understand that people go online because they need a certain degree of flexibility, maybe. Sometimes I think that works against them, but that's a bit of a separate issue. But I don't think that flexibility necessarily prohibits us from doing collaborative projects together. So it's important, again, to use the time effectively so that we can make this actually happen. And it can be a productive and kind of enjoyable experience. You produce a project that you're sort of proud of. So for me, again, last time I'll say it, it's really important that we just get groups connected. And again, it's only a partner for most people. So just get connected early so that you're kind of able to communicate quickly and consistently with that partner. And then everything else hopefully will fall into place pretty well. Okay, so just a couple of notes that I wanted to provide to you, or thoughts based on Unit 4, which I think is a really interesting kind of an assignment or an idea, is to take what we think of as the same short story, right, presented just in two different versions, but to discover some significant differences, not on the level of the word or text per se, which is kind of what I think where a lot of people went. They thought that there was going to be words missing or lines missing or sections missing between the two versions. And I had tried to, even in the unit itself, sort of steer people away from that, like really literal, these are different stories, even though they have the same title, when they're really not. And that's kind of the irony that we're trying to get at, is that we could say that we've all read the same book or short story or seen the same movie. So we use that idea of sameness in a really, like, there's a lot of assumptions that go along with that, as if it doesn't matter, like if the original had illustrations and the one in our textbook doesn't. And then we can even think about, like, why do textbooks not include something like that? Is it just the cost of producing those things? Probably in a lot of cases it is. And then if you think about the differences that we might experience as a reader when, again, to take our example here, if we're all reading the yellow wallpaper, right, the same short story, but I read the one with no illustrations. So I begin reading the story about a woman and the husband, who is also the doctor, which is a really weird relationship, is sort of telling her she's sick and forcing her to rest in bed and not do anything. And of course she wants to be writing, so it's this like power struggle, and she of course loses it. And she just goes crazy, some people say, right? Quote unquote. It's an easy way to write her off, and she appears sort of like unreasonable, not able to take care of herself and all that kind of stuff. So if I read that version, okay, and then someone reads the version that we looked at in the database here, not our textbook version, but the other one, with its original form, and the first thing that they see is that illustration, not of a woman who's like gone crazy, but of a woman who's just sitting there writing, healthy, composed, like totally reasonable. I think that really potentially changes the way that we might think about that character. Or when the husband says she's sick and she has to stay in bed and blah, blah, blah. If I've seen that illustration, all of a sudden I sort of question the husband. Like, what is he seeing that we don't see? And so then it becomes interesting to think about the story fundamentally about like gender equality or inequality, reflecting, right, especially its time period. And so we've both like read the same story, but if our textbook doesn't give us the illustration, it like is a big difference. And so a lot of the other differences were maybe not as obvious, but they're the same kind of like formatting or context things. So for example, and as a lot of people noticed, in the original version, right, that we have access to versus our textbook, there's sections of the story that are divided by the little stars or asterisks. And again, you might say, what big difference? Well, probably not. But taken together with a lot of the other differences going on, and because the whole story is about writing and this woman kind of secretly writing, when we see those, like the actual asterisks dividing up pieces of the story, it kind of reminds us, as many people pointed out in their posts, that these are, at least to start off, they're journal entries, right? And so we have the sense that even as we're reading this story, if these are things that she's been writing, she's been engaged in this activity that she's been prohibited from, but one that would actually like probably help her. And so again, it's not just a trivial difference and we notice it and it's like, oh, okay, whatever. It has like significant impact on how we might understand the story or our experience of reading it. And again, if it was just that and nothing else, everything else was absolutely identical, maybe not that big a deal. But again, taken as a whole, there's a lot of things going on. And I'm looking at our unit here, and so I tried to point people to differences, like there's a little clip of that section break with the asterisks. Of course, there's an image there to alert us to that fact. You might notice that the rendering of the author name is Charlotte Perkins Gilman in our textbook, and just about everywhere else you'll find it. But in the original, it's Charlotte Perkins Stetson, reflecting her at the time married status, which is really interesting. Again, in and of itself, okay, just maybe a trivial detail, but in a story about like gender equality and inequality, it's kind of interesting that we have reflected in the very author's name, and it's different versions, right, in the versions of the story we get, about how even the institution of marriage can change a woman's name. And I'm not suggesting that we need to be for or against the practice. It's just interesting to note, right, that what seems like a trivial difference, but in the context of a story that's all about this woman's existence as a woman at that time. Okay, The other thing, pardon me, the other thing, and probably the hardest one to pick out, you really have to look for this one, is one of the images here. It's just a couple before the bucket, poem about a bucket, whatever. There's a little section towards the end, and this is one of the only, maybe the only, I think, text difference that I've discovered. So the original in ours says, "I kept on creeping," obviously the narrator, right? "Just the same, but I looked at him over my shoulder." This is when when John's here. And then there's a line that reads, "I've got out at last, said I, in spite of you and Jane." And then in our version, it's just a statement. In this version, in the original version, there's a question mark, which is really, really weird. And again, this is like one of the hardest ones to find and even to make sense of. But we're invited to, like, why is that a question at that point? And there's no real definitive answer. There's even some speculation that fundamentally what the story is this sort of splitting of her personality into the one who's obedient to John and that whole medical establishment and the whole gender hierarchy thing. So she's sort of complicit in it, but there's also the one who resists, right? And that gets almost literalized in her and then the woman in the wallpaper sort of a deal. And so when the author submitted the story for publication, the editor, the publisher, didn't really get it. And so he renders the publication, or the printing here, basically incorrectly. Probably he inserts a question mark because he's not even sure who's Jane at this point. And there's no other character named that. So it's probably this point in the story, right near the end, where she's almost like totally dissociated her more authentic I self and Jane, who's also her, but kind of the her that's always played along, right, with the rules and staying in bed and listening to John and blah, blah, blah. So it's a really interesting moment in the story. And again, if that were the only thing going on, I get that I would be making too big a deal of it. But it's interesting that it happens in the context of all this other stuff. The other image that I provide there is the rendering of the original title, all in caps, maybe just a typographic thing. But notice how it splits wallpaper. And again, you might be thinking, God, English professors are so weird. Okay, I'll give you that. But notice that it's a story about what? Wallpaper, yeah, but also like paper as in the writing part of paper. And that like becomes the sort of prohibition, right? That a thing that she can't do. So it's interesting, again, in the larger context, that the original is rendered as wallpaper, almost like inviting us to see those two words and then the whole word wallpaper, like the normal kind of wallpaper. And to then think about, like, in our version, in our textbook, it's just wallpaper, like the normal way. So it's sort of, again, is a minor difference, but I think it affects the sort of the way that the original points to some of the important themes in the story that maybe our textbook version kind of doesn't. And again, if you missed that, I get it. It's a pretty small difference, but hopefully you're now seeing how taken together, we've all read the same story, but it's really, I mean, there's so much that depends on the context, whether it's changes within the story, the illustrations, what comes after the story. So the bigger takeaway is not just that it's happening here for this particular short story, but really like to reflect on any experience of reading a story, seeing a movie, all the stuff that we do, how much our understanding of that text, whatever it is so context dependent, which we kind of forget sometimes. Like we say, we've both seen the same movie, but have we? You know, the title might be the same, the actors are the same, but because of all those contextual differences, there's ways in which we really haven't seen the same movie. So hopefully that's some interesting food for thought, if nothing else. And now that you're getting this, and I think a lot of people, maybe in reading other posts, realized, oh my gosh, there's all of these differences that I totally didn't recognize, because you were maybe looking for more of those like big just text differences, like a paragraph is missing or something like that. But I think it's a lot more nuanced than that, except for the illustrations. That's a pretty obvious one. Okay, I will cut myself off here and invite you to be in touch with me really, really sooner rather than later, especially now as we get into this group thing. If you just can't get hold of your group member, if you're stuck with some tech difficulty, if you just don't understand the assignment, let's figure that out now rather than at the tail end of Unit 5, and then we're really scrambling for Unit 6.